Good morning, everyone. I just have a short presentation today, but we'll be sharing a number of resources for your extended learning. I'm glad to be here with a focus on English learners, multilingual learners, depending what you are reading. The new standards are actually focused on using that asset-based terminology, but because the federal government uses English learners and that's what most people are familiar with, that will be the terminology used in this presentation. So I like to set up presentations based on guiding questions that will really focus and anchor our learning. So what might collaborating for quality and equitable English learner instruction look and sound like? And then what resources are available to extend your learning about collaboration with a focus on language instruction and the English learner development standards. So I wanted to start by making connections to the ELD standards. You might be familiar with those, but in the case you're not, I'd like to share some of those overlaps. So as students are engaged in ESL coursework, they are also really held accountable for growth, or divisions are held accountable for growth and progress in language proficiency. And they take a test every year that tracks that growth. And the test is broken down into 4 domains of reading, speaking, listening, and writing. That test focuses on the academic language. And so I'm going to break down some of the components of academic language. I know that's not a foreign concept to you all, but making connections to there might be some different terminology than how we use in the English language arts terminology in the SOL and in Virginia. So the standards are broken down and organized by key language uses. And those 4 are narrate, inform, explain, and argue. And so I'd like you to take a moment, look through the key uses, the 4 key uses, and then in the chat, if you could put a specific SOL, or if you don't know the SOL verbatim exactly, the topic in which you feel would connect to one of these key language uses. So you could write narrate, and then maybe it's retelling a certain, a book or a text that you all have read together. So the more specific you can get, the better. That way we're really just sharing as many connections as we can in the chat. So I'll give you a moment to reflect and respond. How are you connecting to the key language uses that you see on the screen within your SOL focused instruction? So Deborah, I see argue, write persuasively. What might you have students write about specifically? What are they trying to persuade?
So just like an open-ended prompt that might make them pull some textual evidence from a text we studied, choose a side on, a basic one could be, what's better, the journey or the destination sort of thing. So pick a side, identify a side, and then support your claim with maybe evidence from the text that we read, and essentially argue your side.
All right, thanks, Deborah. So lots of focus on argue, so I'm going to challenge us to think about the other key uses. How do they show up in your SOL? And I think at the higher levels, the SOL are, a lot of the standards are focused on persuasive writing, but there are ways that we actually integrate these other elements even within persuasive writing, but maybe in addition, separate from. So explaining, and explain like why certain things happened, how that event came to be, so the causes and effects of that to connect with the history. So maybe providing research presentations on a variety of topics you're retelling some of that information, whether it's using sequence words, whether you're comparing and contrasting events in history, all of that would fall under inform. And then just to talk about, oh, and Julie, they might be writing a story or reading identifying elements of that, the story or the fiction text, or even narrative nonfiction if we're thinking about history. Lauren, I love that you're making the connection to the chronological order as part of narrate, and those can also help with some nonfiction structures. So we can talk about how they work in their own ways, how we support that language. But even as we're thinking about, I'll bring it back to the persuasive, everybody wanted, the focus was on argue to start, how we can enhance arguments by building in some of the other key uses. If I'm arguing a certain point, while I might need to provide text evidence, I also might need to include a personal narrative. So in the example that was given in terms of what's more important, the journey or the destination, I might need to share a personal example that helps to persuade you to believe whether, whatever my stance is, the journey or the destination. And so building in language connected to all key uses really supports all of them, but then we also want to focus intentionally on the specific language according to a purpose. So if like the chronological order or explaining cause and effect, those all have some very specific language that is attached. So when our SOL says that students need to identify the story elements like plot, or explain the author's choice of words to create the tone or the theme, then that's going to take some very explicit examples of, in that case, cause and effect language or sequence language, depending on what the SOL has. So in the ELD standards book, language expectations are outlined. So for English learners to continue to develop language and connect with grade level content, there are these ELD standards. And they're first broken down by language function. So I've pulled ones all from secondary language arts. There are standards for all of the content areas and all of the different grade levels and bands. They're done in bands for 6 through 8 or 9 through 12. And so I wanted you to make some connections to the language functions you see on the screen. So in the chat, if you could type in how these connect to the SOL that you teach. Are there overlaps? What's the same, or what might be different from the difference between the language functions and the SOL that you teach? So I'll give you a moment to reflect and respond. What are the overlaps that you see? Thanks, seeing a couple of those initial thoughts coming in. Great, Lauren. The skills are very similar. The verbiage may be very different, or there may be differences, and that's where collaboration between EL and content teacher is really important, because EL teachers should be getting support whether they've joined some of the VDOE opportunities or whether their division is leading extended learning. The EL specialists really are learning these ELD standards and can help make connections between the SOL. So we want to have those collaborative conversations to see where the ELD instruction and the content instruction merge. If you're in a co-teaching setting, then the teacher can reinforce these skills within that lesson that's going to support all of the students, is they're all really learning academic language. So I pulled out just a couple of other connections where you can see the SOL on the left, the key language use. And sorry if you hear the background noise, I live by Langley Air Force Base and they must be doing some drills. And then in the right, you have the WIDA function from, or the language function from WIDA. Or this is the, WIDA is the organization that creates those standards. Virginia adopts them. WIDA is a consortium of 40 different states. So Virginia adopted those instead of creating their own set. So when you see WIDA, that's just the organization that really provides the resources around the English language development standards for English learners. So with these examples, you can see is exact. There's an exact replica between the two sets of standards. And then the language shifts. These standards, the ELD standards from WIDA, were developed based on really looking at the content standards from all of the states in their consortium. So it's going to be representative of states that use Common Core and then states like Virginia that create their own systems. And so that's where you'll see some of the shift in language. But we can always make connection back to what we know about the content to understand what the English language development standards are asking students to do. So any kind of questions, comments as you are processing these initial examples? Please feel free as we're going throughout our short time together to put those in the chat and I will stop. Of course, I've prepared some slides, but really want to be responsive to what you all are hoping to learn from this time together. So the features will drill down, they will get more specific from the functions. So we think of the functions as the job that we want students to do. What is it asking students to do with language? The features will connect more to the more discrete skills. So we might think about those as grammatical skills or thinking of them as the tools that students use to do the job. If students are citing textual evidence, what exactly, what are those language chunks or pieces or forms that students need to use to cite the evidence? What does that sound like if students are speaking or look like when students are writing? So I've compiled a list of different features from the standards framework, and I'd like you to organize them. So to categorize how you think these all connect. What patterns do you see in these features? I know it's a lot of text for one slide, but I needed to give multiple examples so you could see some of the patterns. What trends are you noticing? Repetitive language. What is repeated, Patricia? So tenses, verb tenses, syntax development, specifics of grammar usage, So grouping by the grammar skills, Julie says. So verbs. And then different types and uses of verbs. So thank you. Those specific skill sets. I wanted you to do that so you would note some of those trends on your own. I also did some further disaggregation. So getting much more granular and specific than like these, a lot of these are going to connect with what we're familiar with in the writing rubrics and expectations for students' skills, the written expression, the usage mechanics, but we want to drill down. What does that look and sound like? If we're setting language objectives and we need to teach students how to use these devices and language for clear communication within those tasks, then this is the support that English learners need. They need the explicit instruction on these pieces. And I co-taught in middle school, and I don't know if you were around when there was the VGLA, or if you're familiar with that process for English learners. But instead of taking the reading test, we were allowed to give an alternative assessment, a portfolio-based assessment. And we had to break down all of the skills. And so working with teachers and collaborating in the English setting really helped to make connections here. And so, yeah, Clara, you remember those days. But really needing to think about the instruction we give to English learners is going to support the other students in that setting. When I'm working with collaborating with those teachers, I would read the writing of students who only spoke and wrote in English, and also saw an opportunity for their development of precision and complexity in writing. And so while the focus here, our time together is thinking about teaching language, the explicit instruction of academic language, this is something that supports all of the students. And there's plenty of research out there that connects the focus on language to greater outcomes and even confidence within classes and the development of reading skills. So lots of support for literacy development as we focus on language, as language is an integral part of those literacy skills. So here we have the parts of speech. Some of you mentioned this. Somebody had said signal words, so WIDA is calling them connectors. Lots to deal with syntax, so the complexity and variety. Cohesion is something that wasn't very clear in prior versions of the ELD standards, but it's greater in attention, that we need to teach students how to use pronouns and not just hope that they're picking it up based on their conversations, but how we use them intentionally to make our writing or even our speaking more concise and connected. The different word choice we use. We know that we have students try to analyze author's word choice. We can also bring in the meta-linguistic skills for students to think about their language choices and why we use certain words in different contexts. So while we might be focusing on that as a reading skill, we're also using that reading as a mentor text, so to speak, so that students are thinking about their own language choices. And then of course, organization and perspective. So if we were to really put the WIDA rubrics side by side with the SOL for writing, for example, we would see lots of those same overlaps as we do in the standards. So the expectation for language development for English learners is the same. Supporting them is also a way to support all students. It's just critical for those components for English learners. And then the breakdown of parts of speech even further. Somebody had mentioned we want to continue to disaggregate, to be specific in our analysis of language. It's very linguistics heavy, the ELD standards framework, which is familiar for you as English teachers, especially at the secondary level. And so the different ways that we use these and the purposes for which we use these are all outlined in those ELD standards. So again, a great place to connect with the EL specialist to see overlaps and teach those overlaps, not only to support English learners, but to support all of the students as they are all academic language learners. On page 33 of that document, you don't need to see the document, but I just wanted to, at this point, we're not going to open that, point out that WIDA has outlined what those sample language features are. This is their dimensions of language chart, where it's organized by discourse, sentence, and word phrase. So the word phrase level comes back to word choice. How specific or technical is the word or some of the phrases and expressions? Figurative language would fit under word choice. So we teach students how to use figurative language intentionally. The sentence level gets back to that syntax. How are we teaching students to vary their sentences? I would, as I said, I taught middle school, and telling students on their writing, I would say, you need all of your sentences sound the same, make them different. They didn't necessarily know what that meant. I had to teach them how to take one sentence and keep the content the same, but switch the order. Some sentences that works, other sentences I needed to add a certain kind of conjunction to shift the structure. I would tell students to add details, and then I would get lists of like colors or really irrelevant details to the purpose of the writing. And so thinking about discourse, how do we teach them to organize and add appropriate details? How do we use mentor texts to model those skills from skilled writers so that we can tell students we're enhancing their own craft as a writer? And so WIDA outlines all of those linguistic pieces if you wanted to dig back into all of that, if you haven't been exploring linguistics in depth recently, in terms of the disaggregation or the granular focus on language pieces. What makes English, and how do we use English? And in certain courses that might be happening to a greater extent. In other courses, we might need to go back and take a step back. We use language so often. We know our content, we know our curriculum, we know the reading skills that we're teaching, but maybe we can refocus on the pieces of language that we know our students need to be able to identify in the reading and then use in the writing. And so here is an example of an ELD standard, just graphically, so that you can see the ELD standard would be language for learning and language arts. And then the key use in this example is inform. And then the language expectation, we always want students to have an opportunity to interpret. So they're listening or reading information or viewing if it's a video, and constructing. So they're speaking, they're writing, or even sometimes representing in other ways. So the language function here is to add the precision, details, and so on. And by using, that becomes the language objective for English learners. But again, I would argue that this supports all students, that they're adding precision and details, so on, by using adjectives and adverbs. And then, you know, what you share with students, if you want to make it a student-friendly objective, maybe we just say adjectives and adverbs that describe or that tell details about the journey or the destination, whatever the prompt is. You can make it connect with your SOL. What WIDA provides are just examples. And so we want to make them fit with the work that we're already doing with our students. So there is a support. I've shared this in presentations before. I call it a scholar sheet. This is part of the EL instruction toolkit that is available, and we can get that link out to you. But this page 4 lists the different language functions that we have throughout the curriculum. And so even in our initial connection to key uses, some of you were starting to list some example functions. So we can look at an SOL, and then we can decide what is the most connected language function that I want to focus on for the students? Is it compare and contrast, or sequencing, or organizing, or classifying? Is it identifying cause and effect, or making predictions and drawing conclusions? Justifying or citing that evidence, or evaluating and critiquing. So each of our standards would fit, well, these are examples, most of them would fit within or connect to one of these functions. And so for English learners, specifically, this is critical for them to learn that academic language that's going to span all of their content areas. Then we teach them how to use the language of that function. So these connectors, the example expressions. So as we're building in supports like sentence frames, then we are varying the different examples that students can use. So I'll use the justifying. We wanted to focus on justify and argue in a lot of our examples. So if we go down to the column, I know this is a little hard to read on your screen, but if you go down to the column on justifying, we have according to, or based on. So I could say my claim is based on blank, or according to the author, blank. And so we set that language up for students so that they can be successful. They know exactly what the expectation is. When we say cite textual evidence, we're also going to add textual evidence using the language of justify. And here are some examples. So we set students up for success by providing that support. So it gives the English learners the language they need to be successful. It also supports all of the students if they need more practice in how to do that in the academic way. And then as we're thinking about English learners, we definitely want to focus on that discourse dimension to help them express their ideas. And so while it's not specific again to the English learners, we want them to share their ideas, to feel comfortable, and it doesn't have to be grammatically correct. At this point, specifically for English learners, I don't want us to focus on thinking our job is to create perfect speakers of perfect grammatical English right now when they're starting. So I'm speaking about newcomers. Instead of that tendency, and I'll recognize my own tendency to want to correct everything that they said, instead of being that grammar or grammarian police that I was, allowing them time and space to continue to be exposed to language. And if I have a specific lesson, if my lesson is on using past tense to retell, then of course I'm going to need to dig into the different ways we spell, the different endings, and the different irregulars of past tense. And that way I can focus then on the grammar. But if my objective is not focused on that discrete of a skill, then I really want to build student confidence in sharing ideas, where I'm not focusing on being able to spell everything correctly or using correct punctuation. I know that's really hard as English teachers, but we need to think about the research on development. And if I got a paper back, and as a proficient writer for my PhD, I would get some of my writing back and there would be red marks, so to speak, or, changes online all over the place. And even as a proficient writer, I would think, well, I don't want to write as much. And if I write less, then that's less that they can critique. And I'm sure that our students have that same kind of reaction when they get papers back and there are red marks everywhere. When I wasn't, you told me to write about what I, persuade somebody that I think the journey is more important than the destination. But the feedback isn't on my ideas, it's on how I'm using English right now, but that wasn't the intent of the actual activity. So I want us to stand back, reflect on when we're asking students to achieve a certain objective or purpose for language, how can we focus on, then we continue to model and support the grammar in other ways. And so our focus on developing language becomes the language for learning in English language arts. And then strategically, we can include some mini grammar lessons and support. So they will build the usage and mechanics, because we know that that's an area of opportunity for all of our students, as I mentioned. And even sometimes in my own writing, I notice some things that are not what we would consider standard English grammar in some of the emails I send. And so we want to really focus on building confidence for students as readers and writers in their new language in English. And so focusing on ideas and building ideas, and we can integrate as students get to the higher levels of proficiency, when they have more of the grasp of some of the beginning language structures, then we can add on a greater focus on accuracy. And so I learned very early on when I told students to add details. As I mentioned, the writing that I would get back is not what I had in mind when I gave that feedback. So learning experience for me. And so thinking about how I develop students' language, I would create these anchor charts and we would practice. The sentence that we used would come from the text or the topic we were thinking about. And then we would actually have conversations about how we change our writing. How do we make things more explicit or specific? Or maybe we're reading a text and I have them go and highlight all of the information that tells us when something is happening or where something is happening if we're thinking about setting. And so they go in and they become language analysts. And sometimes for beginning speakers, I need to go through, or readers, I need to go through that text ahead of time and I need to list some of those so that even my level 1 can go through, they can highlight, they can do the activity successfully, even if they don't yet have a full grasp of the English language or the text at the grade level. They are still looking, engaging in the same text as their peers. And so we provide more of those supports and we'll see a lot of growth from a level 1 to a level 2. They start to grasp that. Actually, that's the quickest growth we see is from a level 1 into a level 2. The slowest growth we see is actually from like the level 3 to level 4. So as you're looking at your data, if you get a level 3 or 4, we know that it takes so much more attention to precision and complexity to model for those students to get to that level where they no longer need ESL service, which is a 4.4. So even for beginning level students, I can teach them how to add detail. Maybe they just have that more simple sentence to start or language chunk, and I'm still teaching them how to add details, even if I'm providing some of those details for them. So if we think about language development, how did we learn our first language? Through models. Was it giving answers? We didn't think about it as giving answers or parents, giving us the answers. They were modeling that language. So in the same way as we're teaching students the language for learning in English and language arts, we need to give them some of that language so that they can be successful. And then we use strategies like repetition or visuals or videos to help make connections to what they're reading until they have that full proficiency. So I wanted to get us into differentiating. How do we know what different students can do based on their language level, and how do we think about modeling and providing support so that they continue to increase their proficiency? So I wanted to do a little bit of a sort with you. The poll itself, there's a little bit of an issue with the poll, so I'm not going to do that. But in the chat, if you could put the order of colors, they're color coded, but in the case you cannot see color clearly based on your screen or your other needs, then the colors are actually written. So I want to give you a moment to read these. These are the syntax, or that sentence dimension, from the 912 ELD standards. They actually come from the proficiency level descriptors, which tell us at each level what students can do with language. So I'd like you to sort them. In the chat, if you could put, starting from level 1, what color you think is level 1, and then move forward. So 1 through 6, what order do you think they belong? So I'll give you a few minutes. Once we get answers from most of the group, I will debrief and share the actual answers. And you can just put, if you just do one chat response that lists all of the colors in the order. So I see Deborah just started us out and she thinks that green is first. So she would put green and then comma, and then whatever color she thinks represents the second level, comma, and so on. So there's only one post that has 6 colors in the order you think that they go from level 1 to level 6. All right, I am seeing a lot of answers in the poll. It looks like we have some consistency, so hopefully these make sense to you as language arts teachers. I'm seeing lots of consistency here. So here's the actual order. It looks like the last ones I can see are all connected. And so what this means for us is, as we're thinking about our English learners, and we get that score back to say a student in reading is a level 2. So now I can think back, these are actually the expressive. So this talks about the speaking and writing. So this is what I could expect from a student with supports in place to output in a writing activity, so to speak. So it's a level 2. I would expect some simple or compound sentences with familiar ways of combining with coordinating conjunctions. So that might be because or and, some of those more familiar language pieces. So I'm thinking about these levels and what I can reasonably expect from my students, but also the kinds of supports I want to put into place. If I have students doing a writing assignment and the task requires some more complex language, then I'm going to need to provide that complex language for them to then input into their writing. If we're thinking about getting that level 3 student up to a level 4, then I need to look at the level 4 and think about the expectations. They need to be practicing complex sentences. And so whatever topic we're exploring, I'm giving explicit instruction on how, like, all of the examples I use in my writing are complex sentences, and I can talk to students about that. So depending on the level, the depth of how much information you provide would be different, but the kind of support should be targeted to the levels of efficiency. And so in that document, there are 912, there's 6-8 and the 912 that outlines the trajectory for all of the domains, or the dimensions. So we have the word phrase level, the sentence level, and then the discourse level. So what you see here is the sentence level, but there would be this kind of trajectory for all of those different dimensions. And so we consider those as we're thinking about our assessments, about scoring students so they're not penalized for a language level that they're not yet at, but providing supports to get students to produce language at the increasingly higher levels. And so here is just a screenshot of one of those pages. This is that discourse dimension I was sharing about. So how language is organized, how ideas are connected, and then how dense, how much detail is included. So even at the level 1, we can say level 1 students can elaborate with modeling. So right at the top, you can see, or I'll read it if you can't, toward the end of each proficiency level, when scaffolded appropriately, multilingual learners will, and in this case, elaborate through some types of elaboration. So it might be, there are examples like these 5 rules, or, my favorite things. So little chunks of language that we can model for students to then start to use in their own language. So thinking about how we use mentor texts for reading, we're also thinking about using even a sentence frame as a mentor text to get students to practice new language chunks. So I wanted to share some resources for extending your learning. I have given, or I've had teachers in the field give webinars related to collaboration for English learners. Since my time was short today, I focused more on the actual standards and connections and building that academic language. But what those conversations look and sound like in terms of collaboration, I provided those resources for you. So you have a PDF of the PowerPoint. I will upload the version so that you can click on all of the links as well. And then there are some additional resource documents specific to working with English learners. WIDA, the organization I was telling you about, also has e-learning, self-paced e-learning modules available to any educator. All you need to do is fill out a Google form. I'll add that to the drive, and you can request access to this, and you can start, stop whenever you'd like. I wanted to point out some ones that might be really helpful for you in your position. This classroom teachers one, you'll see it's engaging multilingual. It's actually newcomers. It's cut off a bit, but that would help if you are just starting to work with newcomers and wanting to know information about some of their experiences and factors that impact their learning and what you can do to support them. Then that's a great module or course for you. When I say course, they vary. Maybe some are like 2 hours, some are longer for 4, but again, whenever it is convenient for you. There's one on using the writing rubric. This one is, I believe, more specific to upper elementary, but the ideas and the example they give, so the text they give is more at a upper elementary level, but the strategies and the connection to like mentor text and building student writing skills would be appropriate for secondary as well. And then if you wanted to learn more about the ELD standards themselves and that guiding document, then the ELD standards framework module or course would be the place to go. And actually that course I love is like a choose your own adventure, where you can pick a certain position of a staff member. So there's a team of 4, and one of them is a teacher who is implementing the ELD standards, and that teacher is thinking about how do they design instruction related to English learners. So they're looking at the standards framework like we did to connect to language functions and features, and then you can hear that teacher talk about how they're going to apply it in their lessons. So that would be a great resource as well. And then there are a number of presentations, webinars that are specific to English language arts. And within Virginia, there was actually a webinar, I want to say early June, maybe in May, specific to literacy instruction in secondary schools, where I worked with my colleague Colleen out of the English department, and she presented lessons that connected to the SOL, and then I was able to share how we would further engage English learners in that grade level literacy instruction. So I definitely would encourage you to check out that recording. And then the academic language webinar has examples of supports and strategies to get your English learners more involved in your grade level instruction, and then just a number of documents that are available that connect back to the skills that you're teaching within language arts. There is this best practices webinar, which is created in collaboration with my English colleagues. And so to break it down, these are some categories of the best practices related to supporting English learners as you're planning reading instruction and literacy instruction. So making language or literacy visible. The ways that we do that maybe by think alouds or providing those sentence frames and anchor charts. So we've seen some of those examples modeled today. Cooperative learning structures and strategies. The more we can get students talking, the better. Even at beginning of their language proficiency trajectory, the other students serve as language models. And sometimes students will pick up the language, unfortunate or to the positive or not, they will pick up language that they hear their peers use more than they pick up the language their teachers use. And so we can train all of the students to start using that academic language, and that only supports the faster development of the new language English for our English learners. And then always connecting learning to the students' backgrounds and skills. So this is a perfect connection to the webinar, the leader you just had, talking about culturally responsive instruction. We want to make sure that our students feel connected to what they're reading, that what they're doing is relevant to who they are in their lives. And that's not just for students from different racial backgrounds. We can think about the linguistic backgrounds. How do our texts represent students who are also learning English or learning a new culture? And so if they see themselves, their experiences represented, they're going to be more interested, motivated to read. And when they're more motivated to read because it interests them, we can get more of that more discrete instruction in, and they don't necessarily recognize it because they're very into the content. How we parse the texts, how we make that more accessible to them by engineering texts. And I do want to be clear that while adapted texts are an option for differentiation, we always want to make sure that students, even level ones from their first day, are seeing the kind of text that their peers are seeing. Whether it's a paragraph instead of 5 pages is different. That's fine. We want to make sure that the complexity of the language is there with supports. As I mentioned, they might just be highlighting words that they see from another list. That kind of tracking text and identifying. Some students might need support in recognizing the characters. And so that might be a very good beginning activity for them while they are building their knowledge of the English language, if we're learning as fast as possible. And so when we want them to work independently, that's when they can have some of those more adapted texts. There are resources like EL News in levels that you can get they're nonfiction texts, but you can have them in 3 different levels. There's audio available. So if we want students to draw conclusions, they can use that text to draw conclusions, and then you can assign a certain level that's appropriate, or they can look at the different levels and really experiment and see which one works for them, but they can still apply this SOL skill to a text that is their level when we're asking them to do it independently. We model, we support grade level, we provide the adapted, accessible work when we're asking students to do anything independently. And then for our students, we know that we have students in Virginia who are coming in with maybe some interruptions in education. And now after COVID, many students, regardless of their English, their proficiency in English, have experienced interruptions in education. But we've been working with students who, for whatever reason, might have had different levels of access to the rigor that we offer in Virginia and in the United States in terms of our standards. And so we get these students in, and as I said, I taught middle school, and I had students come from refugee camps and hadn't really been supported in writing. And so teaching them to even hold a pencil, and what does that look like in my 8th grade lesson when I'm trying to teach persuasive writing. And so I think about how to teach the beginning skills in meaningful ways. So as we're reading that grade level text, maybe I'm having students, you know, highlight all of the A's in the text or circle all of the A's, and then listen for how we pronounce those words differently. And so there is a need for some additional support, and that's where the collaboration with the EL teacher is really important as well. But we can support even the beginning literacy skills using our grade level texts. And that webinar I shared about secondary instruction and engaging English learners has a lot more of that kind of content. So I would love for you to check that out. The EL Teacher Toolkit, as I mentioned, is available, and it has some guiding questions as you're thinking about lesson planning. So always starting with your content. We always want to make sure that students have access to that grade level content. That's part of our equity. And so once we decide what the content is, maybe it's, you know, causes and effects of, I think it was the World War I or US history. I can't remember the history reference earlier, but we can integrate, we can have students read texts about those events. And so we decide, what is the SOL? What is it that we want students to do? Then we think about the language. You can use that language function sheet to decide what language function am I going to focus on. And then the supports. So this third level, what kind of supports am I going to put in place to make the language barrier as little as possible so that we provide the greatest access to the learning. So they may not be able to read that 11th grade text yet at this time, but we can give them some supports that help them understand what's happening in the text. So we can still get them to do the thinking and then provide some of the English, add English to their thinking so that they can express some of that. Students, our English learners are very smart, and they learn very quickly with the proper supports. And so they are evaluating, even when they walk in from the first day, whether they are speaking much English or they're just really beginning and they say yes, no, and help. They're evaluating their learning circumstances. They're evaluating how they're treated when they walk in that school, or they're critiquing the level of support that the teacher is giving them. They have high cognitive ability. It's a matter of us making what we want them to analyze accessible to be able to then add their way of sharing that information. So it's not easy work, but it's fulfilling work as we're thinking about meeting students where they are and bringing them towards proficiency. And then just different guiding questions about differentiation and engagement. So
if not, they just grab.
Mute. I heard somebody. Okay. Okay, I think I took care of that. Just a few more minutes. And then you have those, the example supports over on the left. Hold on it. Over on the right-hand side, you can see a screenshot of that page of the different kinds of supports that we can put into place to help students access that grade level text and content. And then again, that webinar on academic language in English language arts gives examples of these supports. So it breaks it down in a different way. And then we also have some resources on the EL education website. There are some external resources specific to collaboration, and then others that are created by somebody in VDOE or in collaboration with multiple VDOE, departments. So just to summarize and do a quick debrief, we have just a minute if you would like to share as you're thinking about the information and the ELD standards, what are some of your next steps or plans? And I also modeled some of the differentiation options and support options. There are sentence frames, there's a word bank, there's a visual. If we were doing a conversation, then I'm going to teach you, not you necessarily, but my learners, how to respond to each other in an academic discussion respectfully. So just modeling how you can implement some supports for both speaking and writing within your classes. But if you wanted to share a quick debrief comment on what are some plans or learning from today, that'd be great. Oh, great, Marsha. I'm glad you like the sentence frames in the toolkit. I tried to provide some of those so that you don't have to do as much, but you also want to read, if you have a text that they're working through, then pulling out some of those and being very intentional so that they're using some of the frames and language chunks that actually come from the text that you're using. I try to be pretty comprehensive, so most of them might be representative, but it's definitely not exhaustive. So with that, my time is up. You are welcome to email me any remaining questions. I know that we have an agenda, so I'd like to stick to that. I am accessible by email, and then also you have the PowerPoint I will upload with those links so that you can also engage in some independent